So that kind of talks about kind of the farming and the ranching aspect and begins to kind of introduce you to the concept of business consolidation, which we'll talk about more later. However, understand that it's not just in mining and ranching that you see the same trend. Homestead Act of 1862, of course, allows for this very rapid settlement of what we call the Great Plains. The Great Plains is this whole western territory that's really kind of includes Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and that area. So really kind of between the Appalachians and the Rocky Mountains, if you will. Really kind of includes all the way, almost all the way up to the Canadian border, maybe not quite that far, and down to where the Panhandle, maybe the southern tip of the Great Plains hits the DFW area, right? So, and we live in Texas, so we know that the weather's crazy, right? And climate change aside, the weather's always been crazy, and that's probably in part one reason why those of us who live in this particular part of the world say, who cares about climate change? It's all cyclical, because we're used to pretty crazy weather. And without going off into climate change, I mean, that's like saying, I don't know, what's a good analogy? You're trying to diagnose a problem with people that are used to crazy weather. And I don't think that that's a fair kind of example. So it's hard to look at Texas and say, oh, well, there's no climate change, because it's always been weird here, right? Well, so this is the deal with the Great Plains, right? It's a harsh environment. The rainfall is typically very little, although you have years and you have spells of time where there's a lot more rain. Of course, now we understand this as being the El Nino, La Nina kind of syndrome, right? But in the 1800s, they didn't know that. They just kind of knew that there were periods where it was drier and periods where it was wetter, and then you'd have periods where it was just right. And there's not a lot of big trees. You have a lot of grasslands. This is why the buffalo were so prevalent in this area, and why the Plains Indians were kind of congregated in that area, as opposed to, say, the Ohio Valley, which is, rich farmland, or, the far east that has all the trees, where you have the Powhatans and the Iroquois and that kind of thing. And so you have a very different kind of environment, right? And so this Homestead Act allows for people to come in, get their 160 acres, and it's an attractive option, right? So just like you saw with the miners and the cowboys, you have individuals that want to take advantage of this. Hey, this is my opportunity. Now, the Homestead Act arguably is a little bit different than, say, mining and ranching, because you're not really expecting to get rich quick. Now, you are expecting to kind of put down roots and kind of have a say in kind of what your area is about. So it kind of appeals to that Jeffersonian ideal, right? In a way that perhaps mining and ranching is not Jeffersonian, right? It's very Hamiltonian, on the other hand. But you still see kind of that attraction of individuals and individual families. Railroads, of course, have been given their land grants. They're selling off their land. Now, one of the differences with the railroads is that, first off, they're going to help encourage settlement, because the railroad companies, as they're building this transcontinental railroad, they're going to have lots of advertisements. And they're going to provide credit. They're going to kind of have their own purchasing systems, lots of advertising. One of the famous ads that they have says, "The rain follows the plow." If you just move out here and start farming, then the rain will come, right? Which we all know doesn't make any sense. However, the advertising is very fortunate, because the 1870s are wetter than usual. And remember me saying that it's not really until 1868, 1869 that you start to see people in a position to really kind of take up this kind of Homestead Act and kind of take advantage of it. So it takes a few years, right? And this is all very convenient, because the 1870s tend to be wetter than usual. So when people start developing their farms, if you move out there in 1870, you're going to do okay. You're going to be, you're going to have kind of some decent resources, right? You're going to make some decent money. Well, this is going to matter because, again, like we saw with the miners and the ranchers, individual farmers are going to come out west, and they're going to start to make some money. And as they start to make some money over a period of 5 or 10 years, that's going to begin to attract farming corporations, farming companies. You're going to have investors in the East and investors from overseas that say, hey, wheat farming is a way to make a bunch of money. And they're going to start to be attracted in investing in farms. And so you're going to begin to have these really large tracts of farms. And of course, the railroads are going to be really happy with this because they can sell, if you're talking about a group of investors, they've pooled their money. They can buy far more land than somebody who wants to just buy 160 acres, right? And so all of these things are going to combine together. And so this will begin to create problems with overproduction. And this overproduction, by the time you get to the 1890s, is going to lead to price fluctuations, and this is going to hurt your small farmers. So we'll see the same trend happening with homesteaders that we saw with miners and ranchers, which is that these individual homesteaders who are going to, initially might do okay, by the time you get to the mid-1880s, 1890s, they're starting to struggle because of competition from large farms, because of price fluctuations thanks to overproduction, and all of this kind of stuff. Then you also throw into this kind of stuff, you have Native American issues, all that kind of stuff. This is also part of why Native American issues, because if you have large investment companies that have invested in farming or mining or ranching, they're going to put pressure on Congress in order to resolve these things, right? So a couple of little things. Sodbuster. Sometimes the STAAR test will ask you to identify what a sodbuster is. That was kind of a derogatory term for these farmers that kind of took advantage of the Homestead Act because many of them had really kind of took all they had to get out there, and so they would start off with kind of a sod house where they made mud bricks essentially. It had a thatched roof and all this kind of stuff. They have to rely on digging deep wells because, again, the rainfall could be unpredictable. They do this method called dry farming where you plant the seeds way far in the ground. You have extreme conditions, blizzards, you have grasshoppers, so forth and so on. You also have the role of agricultural technology. We know that the plow was initially created like in the 1830s. By the time you get to the 1870s, you're starting to have what we call reapers, these things that kind of help collect all the wheat. Wheat farming is going to be kind of a cash crop. Cotton production stays important, sugar stays important, but those stay kind of in that kind of former Confederacy. What you'll see is that wheat farming is what's going to take hold in the Great Plains. And really until Russia begins to produce massive amounts of wheat, it's kind of a gold mine, right? But by the time you get to the 1880s, you've got these, Russia's producing a lot of wheat, and you start to see kind of the weather becomes drier than usual, that kind of thing. And then they're still facing the extreme conditions, the overproduction, the wheat, the reapers, the agricultural technology, that will allow them to produce more and more and more, especially the big farms, the ones that have investment capital behind them. That can go out and get this expensive technology that your small family farm maybe can't. So that's going to create some problems. We call those bonanza farms, those large farms. So again, this will ultimately, and we see this in the South with the sharecroppers, where this is going to lead to tenant farming, where basically you pay for the right to farm your crops, that sort of thing. This kind of tenant farming, this large corporate farm, the overproduction, the price fluctuations are going to essentially overuse the land. So there's not going to be good stewardship of the environment, beginning really kind of in the late 1870s, going all the way forward to about the 1920s, so that by the time you get to the end of the 1920s, 50 years of this poor land management is going to lead us into the Dust Bowl and that kind of thing. So understand that this is kind of the precursor to that. And again, wheat, big deal, globalization, and again, this is, lots of problems here. We'll be talking later on that farmers, these smaller farmers, are going to begin to feel very marginalized politically. They're going to feel like Congress only worries about the big bonanza farms and their foreign investors and the banks and taking care of the banks who are loaning money to farmers to buy land or to buy a tractor or to buy a reaper or whatever. And so farmers are going to begin to get very frustrated and feel kind of pushed out. So we saw the same trend happening in the early 1800s, right, where they felt like the banks and the government were working in cahoots together. Same thing's going to happen on the Great Plains, and this is going to lead to political activity with the farmers, and we'll be talking more about that later. Just understand that this is where we get the idea of populism. And some of the major reforms that we'll be looking at in the Gilded Age come from this kind of frustration with this relationship of Congress with the big money interests, whether it has to do with mining and ranching, but particularly when it has to do with farmers, because farmers really, especially for farmers, they're investing in the American dream. They're investing in the American ideal as opposed to get rich quick. And so they expect something different from their kind of risky behavior, if you will. And so I think it's important for you to kind of grasp that this kind of overall development will begin to really kind of shape politics as we move into the late 1800s. Just some pictures here of some sod houses. This is a very basic sod house, a dugout. So if you've ever read Laura Ingalls Wilder or whatever, this is a basic dugout. This is why they would be called sodbusters. This one's a little more stable. You can see this is an African-American family. Still pretty rudimentary. It does have some wood framing. Doesn't appear to have any glass. Obviously, the construction's not quite as solid as this house over here, where you can see that there's a thatched roof. You can tell that these are mud bricks, but clearly there's some wood framing. You've got glass windows. So it's kind of interesting to see kind of sod houses didn't have to be just a dugout. So I always think it's kind of interesting to look at that. So how does all of this, things like the Transcontinental Railroad, okay, connecting the East and the West, and the Klondike Gold Rush, which one kind of little tidbit that I'll throw in there. So we don't really dwell too much on Seward's purchase of Alaska. This happens, 1868, 69, something like that. So it's when, I think it's when Rutherford B. Hayes is president, or maybe it's Ulysses S. Grant. It's right there around the 1870 period. And Seward purchases Alaska from Russia, okay? Russia, czar's in charge. They're having their own turmoil in the late 1800s, which they're trying to industrialize, catch up with the rest of Europe, because Europe's been industrializing since the early 1800s. So they're feeling very competitive with England and Queen Victoria. And so they need some quick cash. So they sell Alaska to the United States. And everyone calls it Seward's Folly. What on earth was he thinking, right? And until, of course, they discover gold in like 1869, 1872, something like that, shortly after he purchases it. And then everyone's like, woohoo, we're so glad of this. And this is what we call the Klondike Gold Rush, right? So this is the second big gold rush of the 1800s. The first one being in California in 1849, second one being post-Civil War with the Klondike Gold Rush. So the Klondike Gold Rush is going to kind of present this kind of mining opportunity again, right as it was starting to kind of peter out in the West, in like Colorado and Nevada and that kind of stuff. You'll see it pick up again in Alaska. And so that's going to attract people westward again. Transcontinental Railroad facilitates this Klondike Gold Rush, people moving to Alaska, people moving west. Also facilitates people taking advantage of the Homestead Act. Because now, and like in the initial waves of migration, when you had the Mormons migrating to Utah, or people migrating to California, when they first migrated, they lost contact with their family, right? It wasn't like they could just travel back east and go say hi for a couple months, right? This was like a one and done kind of thing. Well, the Transcontinental Railroad eases that isolation, so it's no longer about being quite as isolated. And so you have this question of the Transcontinental Railroad making things smoother. You have homesteads that are being built up. The Transcontinental Railroad encourages homesteading, Klondike Gold Rush. All of this is going to create settlement, okay? Now, here's where the real question comes in. Is this a closed frontier or an open frontier, right? We can argue the Klondike Gold Rush is later than 1870. Anyways, but by 1890, you have this question of, is it open or closed, right? Do we need to worry about, do we still even have a frontier? By 1892, there's real questions that there is no longer a frontier. Even though we have areas that are not densely settled, you have basically every area between the Pacific and the Atlantic is settled with a territory, has a functioning government. You've got railroads, you've got this interconnection, you've got global markets, and all this kind of stuff. You've got the movement of people. And when people move to Washington or Alaska or whatever, it's not easy to go back east, but you can do it, right? If you have the resources, you can manage to travel back east and go visit your family. You may not do it frequently, but you can at least do it once or twice in your lifetime. So there's kind of this sense of the government kind of coming in, and through Congress's actions about investment, about these treaties or lack of enforcement of treaties, creating favorable conditions for this expansion, for this consolidation, for individuals to take a risk, then for companies to take a risk, whether it's mining, ranching, homesteading, whatever. All of this is going to create this kind of settled Western environment. And of course, all of this, by the time you get to the 1890s, there's going to be lots of pressing concerns about what do we do, now that there's no longer a frontier by 1890, 1895, what are we going to do, like with the excess population in the cities? How do we resolve this? There was always this idea going back to the early 1800s that if I can't make it in the city, if I can't make it with industrialization, I can pack up my stuff and I can move out west and I can start over. Well, what happens when you don't have that anymore? Where you can't escape the federal government, where you can't escape corporations, right? None of that. I mean, this is a real profound question, and this is something that I think we take for granted. We question a lot today. How much federal government, how much interference from the government do we want? And yet we all have an expectation that our government is there, that our government's providing roads and they're providing plumbing and all this kind of stuff. Well, understand this is where this question, these ideas about governing, how it has this profound change. This is why this period of post-Civil War is where we go from a government that was very different prior to the Civil War to one that's really about governing a large group of people. And beginning to have homogeneity with our culture and all this kind of stuff. So this is where that transition comes in, and it's because of this question of the frontier. And again, is it open? Is it closed? I mean, obviously, if you're in Wyoming and there's not a lot of people, you're going to say, well, it's pretty open, right? If you're going to Alaska, you might say it's pretty open. But if you look at other characteristics like railroads and corporations and money and territories and government, you could also say that it was very closed. It's also going to raise, and this is going to factor into kind of what we were talking about with farmers, which is it's going to raise the question of tariffs again. Tariffs and global marketplaces and all this kind of stuff that are going to happen in the 1890s and continue into the early 1900s. It will be no mistake that we will see the development of imperialism and the U.S. beginning to look overseas for markets, for opportunity, for resources, all that kind of stuff, because our frontier, our access to that within the continental United States is now closed off. And so there's really a direct correlation between those things. Now to wrap up, I wanted to just touch very quickly. We'll be looking at this more specifically in class. But you have this idea of kill the Indian, save the man. So we've got this Western expansion with farms, mines, ranches, this question of, these big ideas with government and corporations and Congress and land grants, et cetera, et cetera. But now you have these Native American tribes, right? And I've touched on the fact that there were complications in trying to negotiate treaties and enforce treaties, and there was a lot of frustration happening. So one of the things that will occur in kind of this frustration of dealing with the Plains Indians is the Department of Indian Affairs. And the Department of Indian Affairs will then begin to divide up Indian lands into what we call reservations. And they'll have these boundaries, and they'll tell a particular Indian group or set of groups that get along with each other or have kind of a kinship relationship with each other. And they'll say, okay, this reservation is your reservation. It's your land. Do what you want with it. Control yourself. Just don't go off this land. And often this land is smaller than what they had traditionally claimed. And so Congress will then guarantee, well, we'll send you some annuities. Since you don't have the extensive hunting territory, we'll send you X number of supplies or money where you can buy supplies or whatever. Except here's the big problem with an annuity, right? This is some of the problem with block grants for states as far as funding CHIP or, the Affordable Care Act or whatever, which is that Congress likes to change its mind. Right? Every few years you get new people in, and you have people, I don't see why we have to send money for this particular program or that particular program. I think we should stop doing this, right? And Congress argues and bickers over budgets and all that kind of stuff. And so this would sometimes delay the annuities. Sometimes it would change the annuities. The annuities were never exactly what the Indian tribes thought they were promised. And then it's complicated by the fact that the reservations were controlled by often a federal official. And if the official was a good, upstanding guy, then it was a pretty well-run reservation. If he was not a good, upstanding guy, it was not a well-run reservation. And a lot of these federal officials would take advantage of the annuities, and they would arrange to get payments. Oh, hey, I'll take your annuity and I'll go buy food and blankets, but he'd go buy old, kind of worn out stuff, food that was no good, and if you're reading The Jungle, you understand what that means, right? And so there are lots of kind of problems with this, right? Indian groups on the plains begin to get forced into going to the reservations because as you have these railroads and the mines and the farms and all this kind of presence of people in the West, you have the decline of the buffalo. And a lot of this is intentional overhunting, right? What you're going to see is that the railroad companies pay hunters to go hunt buffalo. And of course, if you've watched Dances with Wolves, they would skin the buffalo because this buffalo skin, first off, was a fashion statement. They like to line jackets and stuff with it. But they also used it for industrialization, right? The buffalo hide was very tough. They could use it to make these big industrial belts to kind of make the machines go. So the railroad companies, it was a win-win. Let's hunt the buffalo. This will make the Indians not be around, makes it easier to sell our land. And on top of that, we're going to sell the hides and we're going to get a bunch of money for them to develop these belts or whatever. And so this intentional overhunting of the buffalo by companies to kind of help drive the Native Americans out. You have people coming from Europe to hunt buffalo on purpose to kind of have the Native American experience, if you will. That's going to put pressure. The lack of buffalo is going to mean that American Indians have no other choice but to go to the reservation, but to rely on the annuity payments, to rely on kind of that community to kind of keep body and soul together, if you will. But the problem with the reservations is because these are not really intended to, that the intent of them is to allow the Indians to govern themselves, and yet they're at the mercy of this government funding. So it's essentially a government handout. Here you go, you just exist here, we're going to give you money for just existing in this particular area. And it creates a cycle of poverty. And this cycle of poverty begets all these other issues, which is alcohol abuse, disease, abuse, all that kind of thing. And of course, we've talked before that alcohol, as you have these native tribes, this is true whether it's the Eastern tribes or the Plains tribes, as they're struggling with kind of this cultural onslaught, alcohol provides an easy out as far as kind of, these experiences, these kind of rites of passage that they used to go out and have kind of deprivation or go out on these long hunts or whatever. Now they're using alcohol. So lots of kind of systematic things that are happening because of these reservations. And again, the reservations create a great deal of frustration with the Native Americans. You can see you have a series of conflicts. There's very specific conflicts. The reality is the STAR test is not going to ask you about what's the difference between the Dakota Sioux Uprising of 1862 and Sand Creek in 1864, which is horrendous during the Civil War. It really did horrible things to the Cheyenne Indians. Fetterman's Massacre, Battle of Little Bighorn, that's Custer and his last famous quote-unquote last stand. Wounded Knee is actually not even really a battle. It was more about soldiers setting up machine guns and firing into Native Americans. So you get the sense for kind of this back and forth of conflict. And it really is big in the 1860s. Little Bighorn, 1876. By the time you get to 1880, 1890, Native Americans are really kind of, their populations are seriously declining. And they're really focused on this kind of reservation experience and kind of forced into this assimilation. This is what we call kill the Indian, save the man. We're going to force them onto reservations. We're going to force them to accept this new way of life. We're going to force them to accept being an American. They're going to learn to act just like us, by golly. Even though we tell African Americans, no, we don't want you to vote and act like citizens, right? So a couple of quick points because I'm going on 24 minutes here. Why did Indian resistance fail? Technology. I talked about this kind of with the horse versus the repeating guns. But you also have railroads, telegraphs, all that kind of stuff. Tribal rivalries, this council system. That could create some problems, kind of kept, the council system made it easy for treaty agreements to be made with a minority group or to be broken. And then you have tribal rivalries across the different larger groups. So say the Sioux versus the Cheyenne, or the Sioux versus the Comanche, or something like that. So they couldn't get on the same page. So the idea of pan-Indianism never quite takes hold with the Plains Indians tribes. You did see a few attempts at that with the eastern tribes, but it never quite takes hold with the Plains tribes, so that's going to be a problem. Overdependence on the buffalo. So the buffalo, as the Transcontinental Railroad finishes up by the 1870s, the massive overhunting, and that will take place very, very quickly. That's going to have a dramatic impact. So the issue is that the reservation system is creating tensions, right? It's the cycle of poverty, the failure to live up to agreements, so forth and so on. This is creating issues, right? So you're going to have this idea of assimilation, right? The reservation system is not working the way we've initially designed it. So what we'll do is we'll basically force this absorption of culture, right? We'll Americanize the Native Americans. And the idea was to turn them into farmers or ranchers instead of being hunters. So the first step of this was to change their economy and change their values. Or the two steps: change their economy, step one; change their values, step two. Step one was the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887. Breaks up the Indian reservations, particularly in what is now Oklahoma. So if I have any OU fans out there, the OU Sooners come from those that kind of jumped the gun and kind of the land race in like 1892 or whatever that was. Well, that land race is a direct result of the Dawes Allotment Act, because what they start doing, and this is also true if you're thinking about the Dakota Access Pipeline, there was some discussion a year or two ago, how you had this initial reservation and then you had the smaller reservation, and where did the Dakota Access Pipeline go through, all that kind of stuff. Well, this is what we're talking about, right? So you had initial reservations that were set up going into the 1880s. And the Dawes Allotment Act essentially creates this series of ranches and farms, and says, okay, based on the number of family groups you have represented, this is how big your reservation should be as far as these 160-acre farms or 320-acre ranches, and that's all the land you get, right? Well, lucky for us, that left a bunch of extra land to distribute to white settlers, right, or white companies or whatever. And so this is going to kind of create this kind of a second land rush by the 1890s. Again, remember, we're coming up on this closed frontier, right? This question of, well, what do we do once there's no longer a frontier? And so you're going to see that the idea here is to promote individualism instead of community kind of economics. And kind of convert them into this kind of American idealism, right? Except that a lot of these Native Americans have been, in the reservation system, have been trying to continue their culture. Their culture is based on hunting, right? And then you have all the problems of abuse and alcoholism and poverty and all that kind of stuff. So that's another problem. Plus, they often give the Native Americans the inferior land and save the better land for the white settlers, right? So a lot of times what will happen is you'll see a lot of these families will have to sell out and be forced onto even smaller reservations. So this is kind of part of the problem with the Dawes Allotment Act, but its intent was to change the economy and kind of force this economic assimilation of Native Americans so that and here's the idea, so that they would no longer be dependent on annuities. We don't want to encourage dependency. We want them to be independent. So we're going to force them into this particular situation. Then the next thing you're going to see is that you have boarding schools. We want to change their values. And so the idea was to encourage parents to send their kids off to boarding schools. These were federally funded schools to educate kids. Unfortunately, and one of the famous ones was the Carlisle School. Unfortunately, a lot of what they did was they forcibly removed kids. You had some parents that did willingly send their kids to a boarding school because they hoped their children would have a better future. But in other cases, you have Indian agents that would really kind of threaten families and force them to sell sell their kids, send their kids to the boarding schools. Oh, well, I won't give you your annuity if you don't send your kid, that kind of thing. It's kind of, carrot and stick approaches. I mean, we see some of that now with like drug testing for food stamps and that kind of thing. So similar kind of scenario with that. And what they do is they take these kids to these boarding schools and they take them far away so they can't run away home. And they basically teach them to abandon their Native American ways. They change their names, they cut their hair, they teach them job skills, but they do so at the end of, with the risk being punishment, right? They're not allowed to speak their native tongue. They're forced to learn English. They're forced to Christianize. They're told their beliefs don't matter, that their parents are wrong, that their culture has been defeated. And it's really pretty much a horrific experience. And of course, they're taking kids as young as 5. They're taking teenagers, that whole range. And it's very traumatic, right? A lot of times, again, just like with the reservations, the quality of the school depended on who was running it. If somebody was upstanding, then it could be a good opportunity. If it was not upstanding, they would use these kids for basically forced labor. They would abuse them, either just physically or sexually. They were pretty horrible to them in some cases. So there was typically you don't see good things about the boarding schools. I won't say you won't see any good things about boarding schools, but typically this is kind of a dark chapter in American history because you're taking these kids away from their parents in order to say the government knows better how to raise your child than you do. Right, because you won't assimilate the way we think you should be, because you have dependents, you're relying on these annuities. We're going to take your kids away and we're going to change their value systems. And of course, understand that the whole purpose for the annuities was because Native Americans were a nation within a nation. This was an exchange. We're going to have access to this territory that belongs to you in exchange for these annuities. And yet somehow, these things it just doesn't work out, right? I mean, it's really kind of a sad story. And we'll be looking at some other pictures. This is a famous one of kind of before boarding school and after. Again, the direct correlation between the amount of railroad track versus the American Indian population. So lots of really kind of sad stories here. We'll be looking at more of this in class. So I'm going to stop here and